Hi, this is Charles Galda, your host for Vision New England's Church in Action program. This week, we continue our conversation with Pastor Ben Feldott about the Cape Awakening.
You're seeing this movement, and part of how it happens, we have a record. A guy named I'm losing his name now. They're all Thomas Conant. Thomas Conant was a sort of Baptist evangelist. And he actually was the second pastor, I think I got my timing right, of the Brewster Baptist Church, where Doug Scalise pastors.
Wow.
And Conant writes a biography, and in his biography, he devotes a chapter to James Davis, and they tell the story of what's happening on the Cape. There's another guy named Joseph Clark. In 1850s, he gives a discourse on religion on Cape Cod. And basically, he gives a sermon that's published that tells the whole story of the history of religion up until that moment on Cape Cod. It's one of the ways we have a lot of information. In it, he says something fascinating, that during this great Cape Cod awakening, 6 congregational pastors are converted.
So all these moving Unitarian, and suddenly congregational pastors are getting saved.
That's right. I mean, you've got this revival moment. And one of those, a guy named Jonathan Burr, he was Aaron Burr's distant cousin, probably the most influential pastor on the Cape. He loses his church. Of the 6, he's the only one that gets booted from his church on a technicality. He goes across the street.
Because he got saved.
That's right. Because he was converted. He started preaching. I mean, these guys, when they got saved, they went back. They're like, no more halfway covenant, no more Unitarian hymnal, new doctrinal statement, and a fervent preaching. Well, he had a small group of people, 10 people in his church, but they used a legal loophole that allowed the whole town to have a vote, voted him out. He went across the street, started another church. And that church is still on the village green to this day. And fun fact, that church, their building that they would eventually build, was featured on the cover of Elvis's gospel album. So if you go back and look up Elvis's church, that's the church. So, you've got these guys. Thomas Conant goes over to Martha's Vineyard. He's in Edgartown. This gives you a sense of the cost of this, right? There, he's preaching in Edgartown. And the townspeople are so against these revivalist preachers, a crowd shows up, blocks off the house, so people couldn't get in. A woman shows up at the edge of the crowd, and she wanted to hear, and she starts screaming, "Fire, fire, fire!" And the crowd turns and says, "Where?" And she says, "Hell, and you'll all soon be there." She must have been a Baptist. Only a Baptist pulls that off, right? So you've got this real moment where this is all kind of festering, but you've got this moment where the churches are taking a radical turn. And, part of that is Henry Lincoln, the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Falmouth, who has been at arm's length. Now, as I piece together this story, his good friend was Jonathan Burr, the pastor at church in Sandwich, who in July of 1811 is converted. And as I piece it together, my sense is that somewhere later, probably around November, Henry Lincoln himself comes to faith in Christ. And man, it's like a light switch turns. New hymnal, new doctrinal statement, out with the halfway covenant, and man, he starts preaching a faithful gospel. Well, man, the church, this would actually launch a period of awakening. This is part of the larger Second Great Awakening, the blossoming of America, the growth of the town. But at this point, Falmouth has just the First Congregational Church. There's a group of Quakers as well, but the First Congregational Church. Within a year, you have the Methodists come in and they start a church. The Baptists start a church. Within a few decades, we have 4 congregational churches, 4 Methodist churches, the Baptist church. I mean, it's just, there's a flourishing of the gospel and a move towards Christ in this town. And I'll tell you something else. And if you're a Unitarian listening to this, this will not be your favorite story, but I am what I am. Falmouth, because of that moment and that faithful turn of that man, Falmouth does not get a Unitarian church for 150 years. 1809, 1959, Falmouth finally gets its Unitarian church. So you talk about raising the spiritual temperature place from 50 to 100 years. I'm not sure anybody by themselves, but boy, you can see the impact for 50 to 100 years. I do think churches need seasons of renewal, right? They and the influence of a faithful pastor not to be underestimated. So many wonderful stories come out of this. Yeah, go.
And you guys have a town holiday for years.
Yeah. Let me come back to Susanna. Yeah. So Susanna Fish, this young woman who was told if anyone's good enough, sides with the pastor, right? Little boy named Henry Lincoln Fish. Now her pastor has joined the other side. All along, I get the sense that Susanna was a genuine seeker. Like she really, so it's timeline.
So he gets saved. He gets saved. She's still part of the, we're not keen.
That timeline, 1809, Bates comes. This awakening is kind of growing and festering. 1810, 1811, Pastor Henry Lincoln is converted. Probably later in the year. It's now May 12th, 1812. And Susanna Fish is at her house, which sits down on Quisset Harbor. And she decides, I want to encounter Christ. And she begins praying. She is just not going to let go until she encounters Christ. And she begins praying. And by her own testimony in that house, she said, I encountered Jesus and I experienced, her words were, unspeakable peace and joy. And she's transformed. In fact, she's so transformed, she rushes out of the house. She can't wait to tell her family. And then word spreads through town, and everybody, influential, everybody wants to hear the story of what's happened. Well, she begins telling the story by holding services in her house to preach 3 times a day. For the next week, 3 times a day, she's holding court in her house, preaching, telling people about what's happened to her and how it can happen to them. Work in town stops. There's a boat building company that their family was leading, and all the work on that stops. It's really a dramatic moment. In fact, that moment would become known historically as the Great Awakening in Falmouth, or the Great Revival. And this one's been written about a little bit online. One of the pastors, a guy named Doug Showalter, who pastored for many years at Falmouth First Congregational, wrote some great stuff on this. But here's the interesting piece. This is May 12th, 1812. That date is celebrated as a holiday for at least the next 80 years in the town of Falmouth. So at the 1890s and even into the early 1900s, when the church is celebrating its 300th anniversary, there are still people alive who remember being younger and going down to Quisset Harbor to celebrate the Great Awakening at the house where it happened. And I love this. There's a video we created online. That house is still there. The house where the awakening took place with Susanna Fish. So, and
there's a road there named for her family too, right?
That's right. Her husband became the deacon in the church some years later, and the road is named Deacon Fish Lane to this day. And interestingly enough, as you know, it is directly next door to one of a home that the Bennett family owns, who I'm sure the Bennetts have probably been on the podcast here before, and they're very involved in Vision New England. But here's how obscure the story was. I went and talked with Rindy, and I shared this story with her. Next door neighbor, she had never heard the story.
Yeah.
And I've been here 33 years, deeply entrenched in the town. I'd never heard anything of it. So, yeah.
No, so it's fascinating. And so now, how does Whitefield play into this story?
Yeah.
So that's his time, right?
No, this is 50, 60. Whitfield and Edwards are the first Great Awakening. Okay. That's about 1740 to 1750, right? And that's a whole different kettle of fish, right? That's those are itinerant evangelists. That is largely a reigniting of the congregational churches. Those are some of your most famous characters. The Second Great Awakening is probably known most famously for characters like Charles Finney, who would come upon a little bit later. But this in 1809, these are largely obscure characters. There's a great story about their legacy, but yeah, Whitfield, I will say where Whitfield comes in, an interesting, so the Great Awakening that happened in the mid 1700s never comes to Cape Cod. And which is strange because it was a pretty influential area. And Whitfield, he's preaching all over Massachusetts. In fact, I grabbed the book to I want to read it. We know exactly where he preached. I mean, it was very detailed and news reports and everything. And I'm reading it. I'm like, okay, here he is in Duxbury and Marshfield, and he's in Plymouth, and I'm waiting for it. I'm looking to find out. And instead of going to Cape Cod, he turns inland. He goes to like Carver and Middleborough, and then Attleboro, and then down into Rhode Island. I'm like, what? But it turns out in 1752, I think it was 10 of the 11 settled pastors on Cape Cod gathered together, published a declaration that said that George Whitfield and the revivalists were not welcome on Cape Cod. And you know what? He didn't come. Yep. And you can kind of watch the records. It kind of, Cape Cod kind of gets passed over in that season. There's one interesting tidbit in the records in the town of Falmouth. Falmouth's pastor is the one pastor who doesn't sign that document.
Okay.
But he wasn't a revival. He's kind of like, we get the sense he's kind of in the middle. But in around 1752 or 1754, and I'd have to go back and verify, we see the church goes from adding 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 people to in a year, I think they add 40 or 60 people. It's like, whoa, what happened here, right? So the thinking is that year there was a large revival that took place in Plymouth. And so the thinking is that a bunch of people went up there and then came back to their homes. That's the kind of the working theory around that. But the Second Great Awakening, Cape Cod was we were ripe for it, man. I mean, just the churches were there was a lot of people who were looking and searching.
And so there's 2 key players that I find fascinating in this story. There's lots of different people. It's Bates and it's Susanna Fish. And so what ultimately happens to them?
Yeah. I would add Henry Lincoln to that.
Okay.
Lincoln is the hero of the story.
Okay.
I mean, can you imagine holding fast? All of your friends are of one persuasion. Your aura is built around intellect. And all of a sudden, you change course.
Yeah.
Late in life with your church.
Because the intellects were all going Unitarian.
That's right. And now you've got to go back and tell your church, I was wrong. So I think the story of legacy is really, really interesting. So in Falmouth, there's an old burying ground. It really looks old. They're in the process of restoring it. Most people in town don't even know it exists. Falmouth was started in the late 1600s. Around, I think it was around 1670, 12 families show up to start the town. And back then in New England, you needed, I think it was 50 families and a church to qualify to be an incorporated town. So it's around 1782 that Falmouth becomes a town, and this old burying ground is where it all starts. So when you go there, it's just full of people from the 1700s, the early 1800s. In the mid 1800s, we get a new cemetery, and everybody wants to be buried in the nice new cemetery. But the old burying ground sits at the end of a kind of a dirt road, looks behind some iron gates. Nobody knows. I didn't know it was there. But you can go there today, walk down the aisle, and there is Henry Lincoln's grave. And on his grave, it says, servant, well done, right? A paraphrase of that great passage. And then it lists out the dates of his birth and death, like they all do. But in his, it notably notes the dates of his tenure as pastor, over 30 years. Now, he died. He had left the church 20 years before. He was living on Nantucket, but came back here, and they honored him just by noting his faithful service in that church. You walk over a couple of aisles, there's Susanna Fish. Hers, hers is, it says Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, right? I mean, just a faithful witness, her husband, her kids, right there. I mean, the tombstones are, you can see this bit of history, these people who changed the course of Falmouth. I'm looking at all this and I'm like, where's Barnabas Bates? And I've been doing some research, and as often happens, there are multiple people with the same name during that period. There's another Barnabas Bates. He kind of becomes famous in U.S. history, and he was a postmaster in New York City. And I was working with a couple of researchers on this, and a rare books dealer at the church, and we were like, yeah, this is two different people. Turns out, not two different people. Same person. So Barnabas Bates, and I did not want the story to go here. This, when I first found this, I was like, no.
Yeah.
This is not. So
we don't all end well in the Bible either.
Man, the story was great because I'm a Baptist, right? The Baptist leads the Congregationalist to the Lord. This is the story I want to tell.
Yeah.
Well, the truth of the story is that in his late 20s, Barnabas Bates becomes pastor of the First Baptist Church of Bristol, Rhode Island. Bristol, Rhode Island's the hotbed for Baptists. He's climbing the ladder. And long story short, Barnabas Bates denies the faith. He denies the deity of Christ and becomes a Unitarian. And it divides the church. He's sort of rising in the ranks of Unitarians, and he's got all of these gifts and skills. He's connected with Ellery Channing, who's the famous kind of Unitarian intellectual of the period, who's in Rhode Island. He takes his gifts. He ends up leaving the pastorate, takes his gifts, and turns them to public service, right? He's human reason, human progress. He becomes a postmaster. And he famously begins advocating that a growing country, he's a patriot, a growing country needs a postal system everybody can use. And he begins advocating for something that was brand new. It had started in England. He becomes the father of it in America. Low cost postage.
Yeah.
The first affordable stamp would be 3 cents. And Barnabas Bates is the father of low-cost postage in America. I remember reading this and going, you got to be kidding. Where's he buried? Well, it turns out he's buried in one of the most famous cemeteries in America, the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I go up there. We find his tombstone. It's this big obelisk. And I've just got done reading Henry Lincoln's, Susanna Fish's, these faithful statements. Here's this big obelisk. And there it is. Big letters right in the front of it. Barnabas Bates, father of cheap postage. I thought, what an indictment. You finish your story and your epithet is father of cheap postage. Now, it's an interesting thing. The word cheap has a different connotation today than it did back then. Back then, it didn't mean poor quality, bad choice. It just meant affordable. Mm-hmm. But like a lot of things, the word hasn't aged well.
Yeah.
And today, which by the way, that epithet is also repeated on a set of stained glass windows commissioned in his honor at the famous Unitarian Church in Newport, Rhode Island, the Channing Memorial Church. And it's got St. Barnabas and St. Mary. It was commissioned by his daughter. Her name was Mary. And at the bottom, it says Barnabas Bates, father of cheap postage.
Wow.
There's a whole other story of how this conversion takes place, but it reminds me of the legacy of faithful men of God,
Yep.
right? And the influence they can have in one place. Change the spiritual temperature of a town for 50, 100 years. And it goes the other way too. So faithful people like Susanna Fish that ignite revivals in the church, and faithful pastors that just pull them back from the brink at their own personal cost and humility. Wow. So I feel so fortunate to live in a town with that heritage, and to, we would look at Cape Cod Church and we would say, we've been shepherding an awakening, what I call a slow moving awakening, for the last 30 years. I just want to be a part of raising the spiritual temperature of this place. I feel like God's called us to Cape Cod for 50 to 100 years.
I always think God is a God of geography, so he deals with us geographically at times, out of patterns, and patterns repeat by definition. So who knows what's going to happen? But Ben, a few minutes left. For us today, beyond just knowing our history, and that our history is always with us as we talk about, what are the big lessons to be learned from this for us as we look into what God is doing today?
Yeah, I guess I would just leave you with three. One, the cost of awakening. You know what? Sometimes awakening costs you something. It might cost you the price of your pride, Henry Lincoln having to go back, or Jonathan Burr. They had just finished a new church building. Oddly enough, you can go to the original church building that's on one side of the street, and the church he started after he got kicked out on the other side of the street. His people had just raised the money to build that building, and they lost it like that.
Wow.
There's a great moment where the dedication of that church building is it's recorded. The sermons are recorded from it, and so we've got them published. I've got a first edition of it, and none other than Henry Lincoln from Falmouth shows up. He preaches. Let me get it right. Henry Lincoln preaches at the dedication of the church building one year, and it's the new pastor from Park Street Congregational that's just formed that preaches at the installation of Jonathan Burr.
How cool.
So, and in the sermon, they point out, you paid a cost, church. You lost, but look what God has given you. I think there's a cost for awakening. There's a cost for faithfulness. And I think we have to be prepared for that. I think the other one might be surprising people, Who's Barnabas Bates? Nobody's ever heard of this guy.
Yeah.
God used him.
Yep.
Susanna Fish. Who's Susanna Fish? Right?
Yeah.
She's this, but her legacy lingered for years in that town. And I guess that would lead to the other thing, is just the power of legacy. We don't always see how our legacy will last. Yeah, I've been at Cape Cod Church for 33 plus years. I'm still, because I started young, I'm still relatively young. I just turned 57. So I got some years in front of me. But my wife and I have said, well, we love Cape Cod. We're probably, even when we retire, we're not moving.
Yeah.
Maybe January and February. But I want to, after I'm done with my temporary stewardship of the leadership of Cape Cod Church, I want to watch it flourish. So, the legacy of faithful churches. I was talking to some pastors of churches that have we've got some faithful congregational churches in New England. I think of Faith Church in Hopkinton, which was First Congregational, Black Rock Congregational Church, which is now just Black Rock. And there's a list of others across churches that are flourishing. Bethany in New Hampshire. I mean, and you know what? I don't want to just pick the big ones. There are great, churches serving anonymously that have continuously been faithful to the word and faithful to Christ. Wow. What a legacy.
Amen. 300-400 years, right? 200-400 years, some of these churches. You mentioned Doug Scalisi, 200 years.
That's right. There's, the Johnny-come-latelys, the Baptists, the Brewster Baptist Church, which I think was the third Baptist church. The Harwich was the first. Their building was just sold to turn into condominium, sadly. Yeah. Then Hyannis, then Brewster, and Doug's church, a gospel preaching outpost here to this day. And I would say too, to pastors who are listening to this, the influence of godly pastors is not to be underestimated. When you start researching the history, as in New England, as the pastor went, so went the people quite often.
Great point. Ben, those are great words to end on, and a great encouragement, and a great calling and conviction. And so thanks for, so much work that went into this, because you've been working on this for quite a while. And so thank you so much for all of that work. Thank you for taking time to talk to us about it today. Thank you for your ministry on the Cape, for our partnership in New England, and for our friendship. I'm really grateful to you.
Yeah. Grateful to you too, Charles. Have a great day.
You too. This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelism by helping the church work in unity to make disciples, do justice, and share Jesus, so New England will be transformed by the love of Jesus. You can find additional resources and support our mission at visionNewEngland.org. We want to thank our friends at World Vision, who are celebrating 75 years of God's faithfulness and trusting Him with a worldwide vision to end extreme poverty for children everywhere. Join us next Sunday at 2 p.m. on Life Changing Radio. Thank you, and God bless you.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.